Millionaire CEO needs a fake fiancée for a business deal. She steals everyone's heart, including him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Max Morgan, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech company, sat in his sleek, modern office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper in the heart of New York City. As the sun set, casting a golden hue over the city, he leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the sprawling metropolis below. His phone buzzed with yet another reminder of the business deal that could make or break his company. The terms were simple: marry within the month to secure a contract that would ensure the future of his company. The only problem was, Max wasn't in love, and he certainly wasn't interested in being part of a forced marriage. As he stared at the message on his phone, the door to his office opened, and in walked his trusted assistant, Claire. "Max, we have a situation," she said, walking over to his desk. "The board is expecting an engagement announcement by the end of the week. They're not happy with the delay." Max ran a hand through his dark hair, feeling the weight of the pressure on his shoulders. He had no choice but to go through with it. The deal was too important to let go. But there was no way he was marrying someone he didn't even know, especially not for a business deal. He needed someone to pose as his fiancée. "I need a solution, and fast," Max said, his voice heavy with frustration. Claire looked at him with a knowing expression. "I think I know someone who can help," she said. Max raised an eyebrow, curious. "Who?" Claire's smile widened. "I've been talking to a young woman named Sophie. She's an artist, struggling to make ends meet, and she's looking for a way out of her current situation. She's perfect for this, and she needs the money." Max paused, considering the idea. Sophie wasn't the type of person he'd usually associate with. But at this point, he didn't have many options. Claire continued, "I've already spoken to her about it. She's hesitant, but she's willing to hear you out." Max nodded slowly. "Set it up. Let's meet tomorrow." The next day, Max met Sophie at a quiet cafe in the city. She was exactly as Claire had described: young, intelligent, and full of creative energy, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. Sophie had spent the past few years working as a waitress and trying to make a name for herself as an artist, but life had been hard. The struggle to pay bills, the uncertainty of her future, and the constant pressure had left her feeling defeated. When Max explained the arrangement, posing as his fiancée for a few months to help secure a business deal, Sophie was skeptical but intrigued. She had nothing to lose. The money offered was enough to pay off her debts and give her a fresh start. She agreed, though reluctantly, and a business partnership was formed. As Sophie and Max walked out of the cafe together, the tension between them was palpable. Neither one knew it yet, but this fake engagement would change both of their lives in ways they never expected. The next day, Sophie found herself sitting across from Max Morgan at his penthouse office, a place so luxurious it almost made her nervous. She was used to small apartments and cheap coffee shops, not marble floors, and panoramic views of the city skyline. Max had called her to finalize the details of their arrangement, and though she had a hard time wrapping her mind around it, the desperation she felt in her own life made the decision easy. She had agreed to pretend to be his fiancée, but now, sitting there, the weight of what she was about to do was beginning to sink in. Max, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed power and wealth, stood by the window, looking every bit the successful CEO he was. The tension between them was undeniable, but so was the unspoken understanding. They both had their own reasons for being there. Sophie shifted in her seat, trying to mask the nerves she felt deep inside. She had never been good at pretending, but this was different. She needed this. "So, how does this work?" she asked, trying to sound confident, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Max turned to face her, his gaze calm yet piercing. "We'll make it look convincing. We'll attend a few high-profile events, have some photos taken, and act the part. No one will question it. The board will be happy, and I'll be able to close the deal. You'll get the money, and we'll both move on." Sophie nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She wasn't sure how much she believed him. He was a man who spoke with authority, but she knew that beneath his cold exterior, there had to be more to him. "And after the deal is done?" she asked, her curiosity pushing her further. Max's expression softened for just a moment before he responded. "Once everything is settled, we part ways. It's just business, Sophie. Nothing more." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Was that really all it would be? Business? A fake engagement for the sake of a contract, and then they would walk away from each other, as if none of this had happened? Sophie wasn't so sure. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he struggled to keep his emotions in check. It was clear that something deeper was at play here, but she wasn't sure what it was yet. Max broke the silence, standing and moving toward a table where a folder lay open, revealing papers that outlined the agreement. He handed her the contract, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of electricity through her, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside. This was strictly business, after all. She signed the contract, the weight of the pen in her hand somehow feeling heavier than usual. As she handed it back to him, Max glanced at her with a small, knowing smile. "You'll be fine," he said, though Sophie wasn't entirely convinced. The next few weeks passed in a blur of events, dinners, and appearances. Sophie played her part perfectly. She accompanied Max to high society galas, charity events, and board meetings. She wore expensive dresses, smiled for the cameras, and posed next to him as if they were the perfect couple. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. Sophie knew the truth. They were nothing more than a business arrangement. She wasn't sure when, but over time, she began to see another side of Max. When they were alone, he was no longer the detached, calculating businessman she had first met. He was a man who showed glimpses of vulnerability, a man who had faced challenges and losses she had never expected. She had seen him late one night, sitting at his desk, looking at old photographs of a woman and a child. The sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. He had told her little about his past, but Sophie couldn't help but wonder what had happened to make him so distant. For his part, Max was starting to notice Sophie in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had always prided himself on being able to keep his emotions in check, but Sophie was different. She wasn't like the women he usually surrounded himself with, calculating, ambitious, always aware of their own image. Sophie didn't seem to care about that. She cared about the people around her, about making the world a better place. He saw the way she treated the staff, the way she spoke with sincerity, and it intrigued him. It wasn't just her beauty or her charm that drew him in, but something deeper, something real. One evening, after a particularly long and tiring event, Sophie found herself standing at the edge of the balcony, looking out at the city lights below. Max had already retreated into his office, as he often did after such gatherings. She was tired. But there was something about the view that calmed her. Something about being alone with her thoughts. "I used to dream of living in a place like this," she murmured to herself, her breath visible in the cool night air. She didn't realize Max had followed her until she felt his presence behind her. "What happened to those dreams?" he asked quietly. Sophie turned to face him, her heart racing. She had never told him about her struggles, her past. And now it seemed so irrelevant. "Life happened," she said, her voice steady. Max studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "You're stronger than you think," he said, before turning back to the city. Sophie didn't know why, but his words stayed with her long after that night. Over time, their fake engagement began to blur into something more complicated. Sophie found herself caring about Max more than she ever intended. And Max, despite his best efforts to remain detached, was slowly falling for the woman who had started out as nothing more than a business arrangement. Max had never been one to allow personal feelings to interfere with business. But lately, everything had become more complicated. The deal was moving forward, and it looked like it was finally going to close. But he couldn't shake the growing emotions he felt for Sophie. Every time she smiled, every time she showed him a side of her that wasn't just about fulfilling her role as his fake fiancée, he found himself falling deeper. He wasn't sure what to do with these feelings, but he knew one thing: Sophie was changing him. He had always kept his emotions in check, had always been in control of every aspect of his life. But with her, everything was different. She was a reminder of what he had lost in the past, and yet, in many ways, She was a symbol of everything he could never have. Sophie, on the other hand, was beginning to question everything about this arrangement. At first, it was all about the money, about the temporary solution to her problems. She had told herself that it was just a business deal, that she wouldn't get attached. But somewhere along the way, she had started to care about Max. His moments of vulnerability, the glimpses into his past, the way he treated people around him, all of it made her feel things she hadn't planned on feeling. She found herself thinking about him when he wasn't around, wondering what it would be like if they weren't just pretending. She couldn't ignore the fact that there was chemistry between them, a connection that went beyond the facade of their relationship. One evening, after a high-profile gala, Sophie found herself standing alone in the grand foyer of the mansion, staring at her reflection in the polished marble floor. She was wearing one of the most expensive dresses she had ever owned, her hair perfectly styled, but none of it felt real. It felt like a costume, like a mask she was putting on to hide the person she really was. And then, from behind her, a voice broke through her thoughts. "You look stunning tonight," Max said, his voice low and almost distant. Sophie turned to face him, feeling the flutter in her chest as she met his gaze. He was standing there, leaning against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a tension in the air, something neither of them had addressed yet. It was the unspoken truth of their situation. "I mean it," he continued, his eyes softening for a moment. "You've been a lot more than just a part of this deal, Sophie." The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything else in the world faded away. Sophie swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She had always been able to keep things light, to brush off any emotions. But now, standing there with Max, everything felt real. "I didn't expect to care this much," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "About the deal, or about you." Max took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. His gaze never left hers, and for the first time, Sophie could see the conflict in his eyes. "I didn't expect it either," he said, his voice low. "But here we are." She felt a lump form in her throat as she stared at him, trying to understand what was happening between them. This wasn't supposed to be real. It was supposed to be a simple arrangement. But in that moment, Sophie realized that it wasn't so simple anymore. Max reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand gently, and the contact sent a rush of warmth through her. She couldn't deny the way her heart raced when he touched her, the way she felt drawn to him in a way that was completely unexpected. "What does this mean?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. Max seemed to hesitate, then took a deep breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I'm starting to care about you, Sophie. And I don't know what that means for either of us." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always prided herself on being tough, on keeping her emotions at bay. But in that moment, she realized that she was no different from anyone else. She was falling for him, and it scared her. The contract, the deal, everything they had agreed to it was all becoming secondary to the emotions that were starting to take over. Max's expression softened, and for a brief moment, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble. "This was never supposed to happen," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I can't deny it. I want more than just this arrangement." Sophie felt a mix of emotions wash over her: confusion, fear, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. She had never expected this to happen. She had never expected to fall for a man like Max, someone who seemed so detached from the world. But now, as he stood before her, offering her more than just the illusion of a fake engagement, she realized that she was at a crossroads. She could walk away, keep her distance, and go back to the life she had before. Or she could take a chance, embrace the uncertainty, and see where this unexpected connection with Max could lead. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty and growing tension. Sophie and Max had crossed a line, and neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge it. They continued their roles, attending events, playing the part of the perfect couple, but everything had changed. The fake engagement had evolved into something far more complicated, and the boundaries they once maintained were now blurry. Sophie tried to focus on the positives, the opportunity, the money, the chance to start fresh. But every time she looked at Max, her heart raced, and she couldn't ignore the growing feelings that had taken root. Max, on the other hand, tried to distance himself from the situation. He had always kept his emotions locked away. But Sophie was starting to break through the walls he had built around his heart. He knew he was falling for her, but he also knew the consequences. This wasn't supposed to be real. It was a business deal, a transaction, nothing more. Yet, as they spent more time together, Max found himself wanting more. He found himself wanting to hold her, to protect her, to be with her. But how could he offer her that? He wasn't the kind of man who could promise her a future, especially not after everything he had been through. One evening, as the city lights flickered below them, Max found himself sitting with Sophie on the balcony of his penthouse. It was a rare moment of peace between them. The noise of the city seemed distant, as if they were in their own world. Sophie looked over at him, her expression soft. "Max, what are we doing?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air, and for the first time, neither of them had an answer. Max looked at her, his gaze intense. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Sophie. I never expected this. I never expected to feel this way." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had always told herself that this was just a game, just a temporary arrangement. But now, with Max's words hanging in the air, she couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She was falling for him. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't know what to say. Everything in his life had always been calculated. His business, his relationships, everything was measured and planned. But Sophie had changed that. She had become something he couldn't control, something he didn't want to control. "It means that I don't know what comes next," he said softly, "but I want to find out." Sophie's eyes searched his, trying to understand what he meant. She had always been a realist, always understood that nothing in life was ever simple. But this felt different. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it. But she couldn't deny the pull between them. As the night stretched on, their conversation continued, both of them sharing things they had never said out loud. Sophie opened up about her past, the struggles she had faced, the dreams she had put on hold. Max, in turn, shared the pain he had hidden for so long, the losses that had shaped him into the man he was today. And for the first time, they both saw each other not as a business arrangement, not as two people playing a role, but as individuals with real emotions, real dreams, and real scars. As the evening wore on, their connection deepened. They were no longer just pretending. They were starting to care for each other in ways they hadn't expected. But the reality of their situation still loomed over them. Max knew he couldn't offer Sophie everything she deserved. He couldn't give her the normal life she had dreamed of, the life she wanted. He had too many obligations, too much at stake. Sophie, on the other hand, had already started to imagine a future with him. But she wasn't sure if it was even possible. Their arrangement was based on a lie, and sooner or later, the truth would come out. Sophie's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from her old friend, Jenny. "How's it going with the CEO?" the message read. Sophie smiled softly, her fingers hovering over the screen. She could tell Jenny everything, but part of her was still scared. Scared of what this was becoming, scared of how deep her feelings for Max had grown. "It's complicated," she typed back, her thumb lingering on the send button. She hesitated for a moment before sending the message. Complicated didn't even begin to describe it. Max looked over at her, his expression unreadable. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. Sophie sighed, putting her phone down. "She just asked how things are going," she said. "I told her it's complicated." Max chuckled softly, the sound sending a shiver down Sophie's spine. "I think that's an understatement." She smiled in return, but the weight of the situation still hung between them. They were both caught in something neither of them fully understood, and neither of them was sure how to get out of it. But in that moment, neither of them wanted to walk away either. The night wore on, and the tension between them only grew. Max reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and for a brief second, everything felt right. But Sophie knew that the reality of their situation was far from perfect. She had a choice to make, a decision that would determine her future. And Max? He had to face the truth about what he wanted. But for now, they sat there, together in the quiet, as the city buzzed below them, unsure of what came next. but knowing they couldn't ignore the bond they shared any longer. Max and Sophie sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken words between them heavier than the night air surrounding them. The city skyline shimmered beneath them, but the lights couldn't seem to break through the cloud of uncertainty that had settled between them. Sophie could feel the pull of Max's presence, but she also felt the growing distance, the boundary they were both too afraid to cross. The tension was thick, and even though they had shared their vulnerabilities, neither of them was ready to face what came next. Sophie sighed and pulled her knees closer to her chest, her gaze still fixed on the glowing city below. "Max," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are we really doing here?" This was supposed to be temporary, a business arrangement. Max shifted in his seat beside her, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't expected things to get this complicated, but here they were. The lines between business and personal had long since blurred. "I don't know, Sophie," he admitted, his voice hoarse, "but I can't seem to walk away from it. From you." The words hung in the air, and Sophie felt her heart race, her breath catching in her chest. She hadn't expected him to say that, not after everything. "You don't have to feel that way," she said quickly, trying to push back the emotions she had been keeping in check. "We made a deal. We stick to it. That's it." Max turned to her, his eyes soft yet intense. "It's not that simple anymore. I care about you, Sophie, more than I ever thought I would. I can't just act like this is a business transaction anymore. Not when everything inside me is telling me that I want more." Sophie felt a mix of emotions flood over her. Part of her wanted to push him away, to keep things safe, to return to the way things were before they both started to let their feelings get involved. But another part of her, the part that had always longed for more, wanted to lean into this, to see where it would take them. She was scared, terrified even, of what it could mean for both of them. "Max, Sophie started, but she was interrupted by the sudden buzz of Max's phone. He glanced at it, his expression changing from vulnerable to serious in an instant. "I have to take this," he said, standing up abruptly. Sophie nodded, trying to hide the disappointment she felt. She was still trying to process everything, and now this. Max stepped away to answer the call, leaving Sophie alone with her thoughts. She stood up and walked over to the railing, her mind racing. She had never been in a situation like this. She had always played it safe, kept her heart locked away, but Max was different. She had already started to care for him in ways she hadn't planned on, and that terrified her. What if this was just a phase for him? What if once the deal was done, he would walk away, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of emotions she couldn't control? Sophie shook her head, trying to push those thoughts away. She couldn't afford to think that way. She had a choice to make. Just as she was about to turn back to the balcony, Max returned, his expression tight with frustration. "I'm sorry about that," he said, running a hand over his face. "That was my business partner. They want the announcement made tomorrow. The deal is almost done, Sophie. We're so close." Sophie nodded, her heart sinking at the mention of the deal. She had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "And then it's over, right? The deal, the fake engagement, everything." Max hesitated, his gaze flickering with something Sophie couldn't quite read. "Yeah, the deal is over. But," he trailed off, looking away for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "But I don't know if it'll be over for us. I don't know if I can just walk away from you, Sophie." The vulnerability in his voice sent a rush of warmth through her. She had expected him to be distant, to focus solely on the business aspect, but this was different. He was speaking from the heart. And for the first time, Sophie felt like he wasn't just the CEO, the man who could have anything he wanted. He was someone who was just as uncertain as she was. "Max, She didn't know what to say. How could she explain what she was feeling when she barely understood it herself? She took a deep breath and faced him. "I don't want this to be just a deal. I don't want to pretend anymore." Max's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Sophie saw the man she had started to care for. He stepped closer to her, closing the gap between them. "Neither do I," he said, his voice steady, but there was an undercurrent of raw emotion in it. Sophie felt her breath catch as he reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "But Sophie, if we do this, if we go beyond this fake engagement, it won't be easy. I can't promise that things won't get complicated." Sophie looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm willing to take that risk," she said quietly. Max gave her a small smile, a mixture of relief and uncertainty in his eyes. "Then let's take the next step, together," he said. And in that moment, as the city stretched out below them, Sophie knew that whatever came next, they had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The next morning, everything moved faster than Sophie could have anticipated. The press conference was set for noon, and Max had made it clear that everything was about to change. This wasn't just about posing for a few pictures or attending a few more events. Today would be the day the world would know about their engagement, the day their fake relationship would be broadcast to everyone. Sophie felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't what she had imagined when she first agreed to the arrangement. She had told herself it was temporary, that she would leave it all behind once the deal was done. But now, standing in front of the mirror in her elegant dress, she realized just how complicated things had become. She wasn't just playing a part anymore. She was living it. Max walked into the room, looking every bit the part of a successful CEO. His presence was commanding, but Sophie noticed the tiredness in his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had always seemed invincible, unshakable. But in this moment, she could see the cracks. "You ready?" he asked, his voice steady. But there was something vulnerable in it. Sophie took a deep breath and nodded. "I think so." Max smiled faintly and walked over to her, adjusting the collar of her dress. His fingers brushed against her skin, and Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. It was a simple gesture, but to her, it felt like a reminder of everything that had changed between them. They weren't just playing at being engaged anymore. There was something real here, something neither of them could ignore. The press conference was held at one of New York's most prestigious venues, a large ballroom filled with reporters, flashing cameras, and a sea of curious eyes. Sophie could feel the eyes of the world on them as they stepped onto the stage together. Max stood tall beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, guiding her through the crowd. Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. This was it. The moment everything would be exposed. As they sat down at the front of the stage, reporters began firing questions, their voices overlapping, all trying to get a glimpse of the real story behind the engagement. "How did you meet?" one reporter asked. Max glanced at Sophie, and for a moment, their eyes locked. The connection between them was undeniable, but they both knew they had to keep up the act. "We met through mutual friends," Max replied smoothly, his voice confident. "It was a simple connection, and it grew from there." Sophie smiled, playing along. "Yes, it was quite natural. I never expected to be in this position, but I'm happy it worked out the way it did." Another reporter asked, "What's next for your relationship? Are you planning on getting married soon?" Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this question. Max gave her a reassuring smile, his fingers brushing against hers. "We're taking it one step at a time. Our focus right now is on the business deal. Everything else will follow naturally." Sophie nodded in agreement, but inside, she felt a pang of uncertainty. Was she really ready to take the next step with him? Could she really see a future with Max after everything they had been through? As the press conference continued, Sophie couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just about the deal anymore. The world was watching them, and she was starting to question if this was the life she wanted. Max's hand remained on her back, a steady presence beside her, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in ways she wasn't prepared for. Later that evening, after the press conference had wrapped up and the cameras had gone away, Sophie found herself sitting alone in Max's penthouse, staring out the window at the city below. She had expected relief once the event was over, but instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. What was she really doing here? She had told herself it was just a business arrangement, a way to get the money and the opportunity she needed. But now, with Max's confession and the way he had held her hand in front of the press, she couldn't deny that things had gotten more complicated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face what was coming next, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep pretending. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Max standing in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Hey, "You okay?" he asked quietly. Sophie smiled faintly, trying to mask the confusion swirling inside her. "Yeah, just thinking." Max stepped into the room and sat beside her, his gaze never leaving her face. "I know this isn't easy," he said, his voice soft. "But I want you to know that I'm not in this just for the deal anymore. I don't want to keep pretending either, Sophie. This is real for me." Sophie's heart raced as his words sank in. She had always kept her emotions in check, but now, with Max's confession, everything felt like it was falling into place in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take the leap, but in that moment, she knew that whatever happened next, they couldn't ignore what was between them. She turned to face him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure what this means, Max. I don't know if I can do this, but I want to try." Max reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "We'll figure it out together, Sophie." For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something real between them. And as she looked into Max's eyes, she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The next morning, everything felt different. Max had spoken the words Sophie had been too afraid to say. It was no longer just about business, not for him. And despite her fears, Sophie had to admit that it wasn't just about business for her either. Their connection had grown beyond the fake engagement they'd once relied on to get through the weeks. But with this new layer of truth came an undeniable tension: what would happen once the deal was done? The press had been buzzing with their engagement, their every move scrutinized. The public believed it was real. And while Max and Sophie had tried to keep their personal feelings at bay, it was becoming harder and harder to ignore what they were truly feeling. They had promised each other to take things slow, to not rush into anything until they had a clearer understanding of where they stood. But as the days passed, those promises felt less like reassurance, and more like a way to keep from confronting the inevitable. Max had already made it clear that he was ready for more, but Sophie wasn't sure if she could give him what he wanted. She wasn't sure if she even knew what she wanted. Later that week, as Sophie entered Max's office, she found him standing by the window, looking out at the city. The usual confidence in his posture was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable, something more human. "You wanted to talk?" Sophie asked, walking into the room and closing the door behind her. Max turned to face her, his eyes searching hers as if he were trying to find the right words. "I think we need to talk about what happens after this deal is done," he said quietly. Sophie froze, the words hanging in the air between them. It had been inevitable, of course. The deal was nearing its end, and she had known this conversation would come sooner or later. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel all too real. "I don't know what to say," she replied, her voice low. "I know," Max said, walking toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not asking for anything more than you're willing to give. I just want to know where we stand when this is over." Sophie looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Could she really face the possibility of losing him once the engagement was over? Would he be willing to walk away, or would he hold on to something that had always been fake? The uncertainty filled the space between them, but Sophie couldn't ignore the pull she still felt for him. "I want to be honest with you, Max," she said, taking a deep breath. "I don't know what happens after the deal. I don't know if I can be what you need, or if you can be what I need." Max's face softened, his expression full of understanding. "I'm not asking you to have it all figured out," he said gently. "But I need to know if there's a chance for us, once everything is done. I want to be with you, Sophie. I don't want to lose you." Sophie looked away, her thoughts swirling. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the very thing she was now feeling. How could she possibly let herself be vulnerable again? The fear of getting hurt, of falling for someone who might not stay, was almost too much to bear. But as she looked back at Max, his words seemed to pierce through her defenses. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered, the weight of her own emotions catching up with her. "I don't know if I'm ready to let you in." Max stepped closer, his presence comforting but firm. "I'm not asking you to be ready right away," he said, "but I'm asking for a chance to see where this could go. We can figure it out together." Sophie's heart ached as she took in his words. He wasn't rushing her. He wasn't pressuring her to make a decision right now. But the truth was, she didn't want to walk away from him. She didn't want to let fear hold her back from something real. "I don't want to lose you either," Sophie said, her voice trembling. Max reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. Then don't, he said simply. Sophie took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She wasn't ready to make any promises. She wasn't ready to decide what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice, like she could choose to move forward, despite the fear and uncertainty. Let's see where this goes, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Max smiled, relief washing over his face. We'll take it one step at a time. And with that, for the first time, Sophie felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that she wasn't alone in facing it. Together, they would figure it out. The following week, everything seemed to be moving faster than either Max or Sophie had anticipated. The public announcement about their engagement had made headlines, and the media was now paying attention to every detail of their lives. The world was watching, and both of them felt the weight of it. Yet, despite the chaos surrounding them, something shifted between them. The tension that had once defined their relationship began to melt away, replaced by a growing trust that neither of them had expected. But the real test was still to come. Max had been burying himself in work, but Sophie could tell he was distracted, lost in thought more often than usual. He wasn't as carefree as he had been when they first started their arrangement. It wasn't just the deal anymore, it was their future that was at stake. And Max had always been the kind of man who took control of his destiny. But now, his destiny was tangled with hers, and he wasn't sure what that meant for either of them. Sophie, on the other hand, was doing her best to navigate the growing complexity of her emotions. She had always been a realist, someone who kept her heart guarded. But lately, her feelings for Max had been undeniable. She cared for him more than she had planned to. And as they spent more time together, Sophie realized that the life she had imagined for herself, one where she kept everything under control, was no longer enough. Max had shown her what it meant to take risks, to open up, and it terrified her. The night before a major charity gala, Sophie found herself standing by the window of Max's penthouse, looking out over the sparkling lights of the city. The quiet was a stark contrast to the whirlwind of the past few days. She had been preparing for the event, but her mind kept drifting back to Max. She had told herself not to get too attached, but now, she couldn't deny what was happening. She had started to fall for him, and the reality of it was both thrilling and terrifying. Max appeared behind her, his presence as commanding as ever. But tonight, there was something different about him. He wasn't just the confident CEO. He was the man she had come to know vulnerable, unsure, and yet still so strong. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice softening as he stepped closer. Sophie turned to face him, her heart racing. "I'm fine," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. Max studied her for a moment, as if trying to read her thoughts. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said gently. Sophie hesitated before speaking, the words coming out before she could stop herself. "I'm scared, Max." His expression softened, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "Scared of what?" he asked, his voice low. "Scared of what this is becoming," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can let myself fall for you." Max stepped closer, his hand still holding hers, the warmth of his touch grounding her. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I just want to be with you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat at his words. They had both been holding back, both afraid to admit the truth, but in that moment, it felt like everything was shifting. "I'm not perfect," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what this means, or where it's going, but I want to try." Max smiled softly, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "That's all I'm asking for," he said quietly. The moment hung between them, charged with the rawness of their emotions, and Sophie felt a sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to face it alone. They had started this journey as strangers, bound by a business deal, but now they were something more. Together, they had created a connection that neither of them could deny. The next day, at the gala, Sophie walked beside Max, her hand in his, both of them playing their roles for the cameras. But there was a subtle difference now. The way he held her hand, the way their eyes met, told a story that no one else could see. They were no longer just pretending. The world saw them as the perfect couple, but they knew the truth. They were starting to build something real. The night was a blur of speeches, photo ops, and polite conversation. But through it all, Max and Sophie remained side by side. The bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. As the event came to a close, Max turned to Sophie, his expression serious. "Can we talk?" he asked. Sophie nodded, following him to a quieter corner of the venue. "I don't want to hide anymore," he said, his voice low. "I'm done with pretending that this is just a business arrangement. It's real. And I need you to know that." Sophie's heart swelled at his words, the truth of them sinking in. "I feel the same," she replied softly. Max smiled, a look of relief washing over his face. "Then we'll figure this out together," he said. And in that moment, as they stood in the quiet corner of the gala, Sophie knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, no longer pretending, no longer hiding from what they had started to build. The weeks that followed were filled with a new sense of urgency. Max and Sophie had made a decision, one that would affect the rest of their lives. Their once fake engagement had transformed into something real, but the world around them hadn't stopped. The business deal that had initially brought them together was now at a critical point, and both of them knew that they couldn't afford any distractions. Despite the growing connection between them, there was still a weight of uncertainty hanging in the air. Sophie had spent so much of her life keeping her heart guarded, and now, with everything moving forward so quickly, she wasn't sure she could keep up. The media was constantly watching them, constantly analyzing their every move. But it wasn't just the public that they had to contend with. Max's family was beginning to question the legitimacy of their relationship. Sophie had met Max's younger brother, Nathan, just a few days earlier at a family gathering, and the interaction had left her uneasy. Nathan was charming, but there was an underlying tension that made Sophie uncomfortable. She knew that Nathan didn't fully approve of her, and the more time she spent with him, the more she could sense his skepticism. It wasn't long before Sophie realized that Nathan wasn't the only one who had doubts. Max's parents, though polite, had been distant, as if they were waiting for something to happen to prove the authenticity of their relationship. It made Sophie question everything. Was she just a pawn in Max's game to secure a deal? Or was there something more between them? Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Max invited Sophie to join him for a quiet dinner at a restaurant away from the public eye. Sophie agreed, needing a break from the whirlwind that had become her life. As they sat down at their table, the soft glow of the candlelight flickering between them, Sophie looked at Max, her mind racing. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. Max looked up from his menu, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. Sophie hesitated, not wanting to sound like she was complaining, but the emotions had built up to a point where she couldn't keep them inside any longer. "The media, your family, the pressure, it's all too much. I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is fine. I'm starting to feel like I'm just a part of your plan, like I don't even matter outside of the deal." Max's face softened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Sophie, that's not how I see this. I never wanted you to feel like a pawn in this. I told you, this was never supposed to be just a business arrangement for me. I care about you, more than I ever thought possible. And I know this is hard. I know it's been overwhelming. But we're in this together, and I'm not going to let you feel like this anymore." Sophie felt the weight of his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the doubts that had clouded her mind. But the truth was, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to handle everything. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not needing anyone. But now, with Max's words and the deep connection they shared, she realized how much she had come to rely on him. She wasn't sure if that made her weak, or if it was just part of falling in love. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of losing myself in this. Scared of losing you once the deal is done." Max squeezed her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her skin. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. We'll figure this out. I won't let this be something that ruins us. I want to be with you, for real. When this deal is over, we'll have the time and space to figure things out, just the two of us." Sophie's heart ached at the thought of life after the deal. but Max's words gave her a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that they could have something beyond the engagement, beyond the pressure of the business deal. As the dinner continued, their conversation shifted away from the stress of the deal and back to the connection they had formed. Max told her stories about his childhood, his dreams for the future, and his hopes for the company. Sophie, in turn, shared her own dreams, the ones she had kept hidden for so long, the ones she hadn't allowed herself to think about. By the time the night came to an end, Sophie felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Max had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: a sense of certainty in the midst of all the uncertainty. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. As they left the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air, Max turned to her, his eyes soft. "I meant what I said, Sophie. We're in this together, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie smiled, feeling her heart swell with emotion. "I believe you," she said quietly, knowing that whatever happened next, they would face it together. As the weeks passed, the pressure from the outside world only intensified. Max and Sophie's engagement was now a public spectacle, with the media tracking their every move. While they had settled into a routine of attending high-profile events and putting on a perfect show for the world, things between them were beginning to shift. The line between their real feelings and the facade they were maintaining had become increasingly blurred. Sophie was starting to feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. Every time she stepped into the public eye, she was reminded of the expectations that had been placed on her. The constant scrutiny, the whispers behind her back, and the unspoken doubts from Max's family had begun to take their toll. Despite their growing connection, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing herself in this whirlwind. She was no longer sure who she was anymore. Was she the woman Max had come to care about? Or was she just playing a role in a contract? Max, on the other hand, was doing his best to keep things together. He had always been someone who could handle stress, but lately, the pressure was starting to show. The deal was nearing its final stages, and he was constantly battling with his own doubts. He had made promises to Sophie, but he knew the harsh truth. Once the deal was done, there was no guarantee that what they had built would last. It was a reality neither of them wanted to face. One night, after a particularly difficult board meeting, Max found Sophie sitting by the window in his penthouse, staring out at the skyline. The soft glow of the city lights reflected in her eyes, but there was a sadness there that he couldn't ignore. "Sophie," he said, his voice low as he walked toward her. "You okay?" Sophie turned to look at him, her expression soft but weary. "I don't know, Max," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm losing myself in this. I don't even know who I am anymore." Max stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He had always been able to read her, but this was different. She was shutting down, and he knew he had to find a way to get through to her. "I get it," he said softly, his tone full of understanding. "It's been a lot, but I need you to know something, Sophie." Sophie looked up at him, her heart racing. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max knelt down beside her, taking her hand in his. "I don't care about the deal anymore. I don't care about the press, the expectations, or what anyone thinks. I care about you, and I'm willing to fight for this, for us." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had heard him say that he cared before, but something about the sincerity in his voice made it feel real, in a way she hadn't let herself believe. She had always been afraid of vulnerability, of letting someone in, but now she realized that she had already let him in, and there was no turning back. "But what happens when this is all over?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happens when the deal is done, and we go back to our separate lives?" Max took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "We figure it out," he said simply. "We take the time to see if this is something real, something worth fighting for. I don't want to lose you, Sophie. I don't want to walk away from what we have." Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for everything that was coming, but in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let fear dictate her life anymore. She had spent too much time hiding from the truth, from what she truly wanted, and what she wanted, more than anything, was to be with Max. She took a deep breath and nodded, her voice steady now. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's figure it out." Max's face broke into a relieved smile, And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this anymore. They were in this together, and whatever happened next, they would face it side by side. As they stood there, in the quiet of the night, Sophie realized that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. With Max by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work after all. The days following their conversation were filled with an unspoken agreement. Max and Sophie had made a decision to stop hiding behind the facade of their engagement, to stop pretending it was all just for the sake of business. They had taken the first step towards something real, something that neither of them could have predicted. But with that decision came new challenges. Sophie found herself caught in the whirlwind of emotions she had spent years avoiding. For so long, she had kept her heart locked away, afraid to get too close to anyone, afraid to let anyone see her vulnerabilities. But Max had done exactly that. He had broken through her defenses, and she found herself falling for him in ways she had never anticipated. As for Max, he was equally conflicted. He had always been in control of his emotions, focused solely on the success of his company and the demands of his high-profile life. But Sophie had changed all of that. Now, as they spent more time together, Max found himself questioning everything he had built, everything he had once valued. He wasn't just in it for the deal anymore. He was in it for her. But as their connection deepened, so did the complications. Max's family was becoming increasingly skeptical of the engagement, and the pressure from the board of directors was mounting. Sophie couldn't ignore the cold looks from Max's parents and the whispers behind her back from his colleagues. She had never felt like she truly belonged in their world, and now, with the stakes higher than ever, she wasn't sure if she could handle the pressure. One afternoon, as they sat together in Max's office, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something that might not be sustainable. The deal was almost finalized, and soon, everything would change. Sophie turned to Max, her heart pounding in her chest. "Max, I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Max looked up from his desk, concern flashing in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft. "I mean, I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is okay," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop herself. "The deal, the engagement, the pressure. It's too much. I'm starting to feel like I'm losing myself in all of this." Max walked over to her, his expression filled with empathy. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch grounding her in the moment. "Sophie," he said quietly, "I never wanted this to be something that would hurt you. I've always had control over my life. But with you, it's different. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be with me, to fight for us, because I want to be with you. I don't want to lose you." Sophie's heart ached at his words. She had always been independent, always kept herself at arm's length from anyone who might hurt her. But Max was different. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the man who had shown her a side of herself she didn't know existed. A side that was vulnerable, open, and willing to take risks. But was she willing to take those risks with him? "I'm scared, Max," she whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I'm scared that when this deal is done, when everything is over, you'll walk away. I'm scared that this is all just temporary." Max's gaze softened, and he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as if he could protect her from all of her fears. "Sophie, this is not temporary. I'm not just here for the deal. I'm here for you. We're in this together, and I'm not going anywhere." The sincerity in his voice reached deep into her soul. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "But what about the future?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens after the deal is done? What happens when the world stops watching us?" Max pulled back slightly, his hands still resting on her shoulders. "We take it one day at a time," he said. "We figure it out together. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm just asking for a chance to see if we can build something real." Sophie looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. The uncertainty still lingered, but she was no longer afraid of it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that whatever came next, she didn't want to face it alone. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "Let's see where this goes." Max smiled, a look of relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Sophie nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, doubts, and challenges. But for the first time, she felt ready to face them. She wasn't just playing a role anymore. She was in this for real. And with Max by her side, she was willing to fight for their future, whatever it might be. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, the pressure of their situation grew. The business deal was drawing to a close, and Max and Sophie were faced with the reality that the life they had built, though full of affection and unspoken understanding, was based on a contract. Sophie had tried to push the thoughts of what would happen after the deal was done, but the more time she spent with Max, the harder it became to ignore the truth. The truth that this wasn't just business anymore. It wasn't just an arrangement. It was real. And with that came all the complications of real feelings. Max, too, found himself in the same predicament. He had promised Sophie that they would figure things out together, but as the deal came closer to finalization, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. He wasn't just terrified of the business deal falling apart. He was scared of losing Sophie. For the first time in his life, the thought of his empire didn't dominate his every waking moment. It was Sophie who filled his mind, her smile, her touch, the way she made him feel like a man who could be both successful and vulnerable at the same time. But with those feelings came the overwhelming realization that once the deal was done, the eyes of the world would turn elsewhere. The media would move on, and Max wasn't sure what would be left of them. One late afternoon, Max and Sophie found themselves alone at Max's penthouse, the tension in the air palpable. The day had been filled with business meetings, and although they were in the same space, it felt like they were miles apart. Sophie stood by the window, staring out at the skyline, her thoughts running wild. She was grateful for everything Max had done for her, for the chance to step into a world she never thought she could be a part of. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something, a precipice that might break them both if they weren't careful. Max walked up behind her, his presence warm but silent. "Sophie," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I know you're worried. I can see it in your eyes. But we've made it this far together. We're not done yet." Sophie turned to face him, her heart heavy with emotion. "I'm scared, Max," she said softly, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "Scared of what happens when this is all over. Scared of what happens when the world moves on, and we're left with nothing but our feelings." Max took a deep breath, stepping closer to her. "Sophie," he said gently, "I know this hasn't been easy, but I'm not asking you to trust just the deal or the world's expectations. I'm asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust that what we've built isn't going to fall apart the moment the cameras go away." Sophie looked at him, her chest tightening. "But what if it does? What if I'm just someone in your world of high-profile deals and business transactions?" Max shook his head, his hand gently brushing against hers. "No, you're not just someone in my world. You've changed everything for me. You make me believe in something more than just success, Sophie. I never thought I would be able to say this, but you've made me want to fight for something more. You're the reason I'm still standing." The sincerity in Max's voice left Sophie speechless. She had always been the one to keep her emotions in check, but hearing him speak from his heart broke down the walls she had built around herself. For the first time, she let herself believe that what they had was real, that they had a chance. "So what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max took a step closer, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We face the truth, Sophie, together. We don't have all the answers, but we have each other, and that's enough for me." Sophie looked into his eyes, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had always been afraid of losing herself in someone else, but with Max, she realized she wasn't losing herself at all. She was learning how to be vulnerable, how to trust, and how to love without fear. "Then let's make it real," Sophie said, her voice steady as she took his hand in hers. "Let's not hide behind the deal anymore. Let's figure this out, no matter what happens." Max smiled, his heart lifting at her words. "No more hiding, then," he said, pulling her close. "We'll face everything together." As they stood there, their hearts beating in sync, Sophie realized that the future wasn't as uncertain as she had thought. They didn't need to have everything figured out right now. They had each other, and that was enough to start building the life they both wanted. The deal might have brought them together, but it was their love that would keep them strong, no matter what the world threw at them. Months had passed, since Max and Sophie made their decision to let go of the facade and face the truth of their feelings for one another. The world, once obsessed with the business deal that had brought them together, had begun to shift its focus. The engagement was still in the public eye, but the press had lost interest in their every move. Now, Max and Sophie were finally able to focus on their relationship, free from the constant scrutiny that had once threatened to pull them apart. The business deal was completed, and the world seemed to finally accept that what had started as a mere arrangement was now something real. Max had kept his promise to Sophie. They had worked through the uncertainties, the pressures, and the complications of their lives to create something built on trust, love, and mutual respect. What they had was no longer a transaction, it was a partnership. One that neither of them had expected to form, but now couldn't imagine living without. Sophie had found herself in a place she never thought possible. She had once kept herself guarded, fearful of vulnerability. But Max had shown her a side of herself she had been too afraid to explore. She had discovered that love wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing each other's flaws and supporting one another through both the good and bad. Max had done just that. He had been there when she needed him. And now, as they stood together in the quiet of their home, Sophie realized that they had built something strong. Max, too, had found a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. His world had always been driven by ambition, success, and the need for control. But Sophie had taught him that life was about more than just business deals and boardrooms. It was about connection, about love, and about finding someone who saw him for who he really was. Max had finally allowed himself to let go of the need to always be in control, to open himself up to the possibility of something more. The life they were building wasn't about the glamorous world he had once known. It was about building a future together, no matter what came their way. That evening, as they sat on the couch, sharing a quiet moment, Max looked over at Sophie with a smile that spoke volumes. "I think we've come a long way, haven't we?" he said softly. Sophie met his gaze, her heart swelling with emotion. "We have," she replied, her voice steady and full of certainty. "I never thought I would find something like this, something real." Max's smile deepened, and he reached for her hand, gently squeezing it. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we found it together." Sophie leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. They had come so far from the uncertainty that had once defined their relationship. The future was no longer something they feared. It was something they were ready to face together. As Max kissed the top of her head, Sophie realized that love wasn't just a promise made in the heat of the moment. It was a decision made every day. And they had both made that decision to choose each other, to build a life together, and to embrace the imperfections that made them who they were. It wasn't always going to be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and obstacles along the way. But for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt confident that, with Max by her side, they could handle anything. The journey they had started together was just the beginning. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Sophie and Max continued to grow, not just as a couple, but as individuals. They had learned to navigate the complexities of love, ambition, and the realities of life, always with the unwavering support of one another. They didn't need a grand gesture or a perfect ending. What they had was more than enough. They had found something real, and that was all that mattered. And so, as they looked ahead to the future, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever before. Discover a heartfelt journey of love, ambition, and unexpected connections in this captivating story of two people brought together by a business deal that turned into something real. Follow the ups and downs of their evolving relationship as they navigate the complexities of fame, family pressure, and personal growth. This engaging story captures the essence of what it means to fight for love and trust in the face of external obstacles. It's a perfect addition to the genre of millionaire stories, where wealth, success, and vulnerability collide to create something truly beautiful. As Sophie and Max navigate their path, they find themselves questioning the true meaning of their connection and whether their love can survive after the deal is done. The story reveals the raw emotions and challenges of building a life together when both individuals come from different worlds, making this one of the most relatable millionaire stories to date. As the tension rises, Sophie and Max must decide whether their love is worth the risk of exposing themselves to the world. But ultimately, they choose each other, knowing that the real value lies in their shared experiences. Get ready for an unforgettable conclusion that will leave you reflecting on the true power of love, the lessons learned, and the incredible journey of self-discovery. This is one of the most compelling millionaire stories you'll hear, filled with romance, heartache, and triumph. Immerse yourself in the final chapter of their story, where love and commitment take center stage, proving that even the most unlikely beginnings can lead to a lifetime of happiness. Don't miss out on this heartfelt and inspiring tale of love and second chances, a shining example of how millionaire stories can go beyond the wealth to show the deeper meaning of connection and heart.